Hi everyone, my name is Bren Simmers and I'm the Managing Editor of Island Studies Press. Today I'm going to be reading from Listening for the Dead Bells by Marian, Highland Magic in Prince Edward Island. And this is a collection of folklore, stories about superstitions, omens, forerunners, second sight, stories that Marian has collected through interviews with islanders, and stories that have been carried and transmitted from ancestors from the Highlands of Scotland to Prince Edward Island. I'm going to start by reading from the title chapter, which is called Listening for the Dead Bells. When I was 6 years old, I saw my first corpse, the ashen face, shockingly still body of Effie MacDonald, my father's aunt, lying in an open casket in her parlor. Unprepared for this horror, I hid my face in my mother's coat and begged her to leave. The grown-ups kept smiling and talking. Their composure bewildered me almost as much as did the doll-like form in front of us. Many years and many wakes later, I'm not much closer to getting my head around the reality of a person who is somehow there but not there. But at least I understand my mother's apparent detachment. In a culture with a preoccupation with death, many of us learned at an early age that death, ours or somebody else's, is just around the corner, and that we might as well be stoic about it, and that it wouldn't hurt to listen for the approaching footfalls. A deathbed was a public spectacle to which a child was brought for edification, as a warning to his own latter end, Sir Andrew MacPhail wrote in his memoir of 19th century island life. I have yet before my eyes the spectacle of the blacksmith who, as I now know, was dying of pneumonia. Angus MacLean, a former federal cabinet minister and premier of Prince Edward Island, was not quite 3 years old when an adult picked him up to show him the body of his little brother, lying in a small white coffin on the dining room table. It is not clear whether this was for Angus's edification, but, like MacPhail, he remembered this scene for the rest of his life. It is not unusual to take children to a wake in those days, although some of the horrors children were subjected to in 19th century Scotland, fortunately, had been abandoned. After someone died in the Highlands, visitors typically touched the body to prevent being haunted in their nightmares. I have seen young children and even infants made to touch the face of the corpse, folklore collector Reverend James Napier wrote, notwithstanding their terror and screams. Napier does not mention whether the ritual itself induced nightmares. Presumably, the little Highland children got used to touching bodies, just as we did to viewing them. By the time my father's aunt Sarah Bruce died, I was 8 years old and already blasé about funerals. On a sweltering hot day in August, close family members were crowded into her tiny parlor, while neighbors gathered elsewhere in the house. The coffin was beside an open window, through which flies buzzed in and out. What unsettled me that day was not the nearness of the body, but the sight of poor Uncle Lachi, 87 years old, sitting beside the casket, with a big white handkerchief in his hand, alternately daubing his eyes and shooing flies away from his wife's face. I'm going to skip ahead and read a little bit from a chapter called They All Believed in Lights Then. In the era when rural island homes depended on kerosene lamps, Abina Daly of Iris, then 18 years old, was spending an evening in a dimly lit kitchen with her fiancé, Carlton Hume. At some point, a strange light shone in through the window. It traveled along the table and over the couch where we were sitting, Abina recalled, and then went back out the window. The young couple remained puzzled by this episode for a while, although given the significance attached to lights in their corner of the island, both probably had their suspicions. If so, they were confirmed 2 years later, after Abina and Carlton were married. Their first child died at birth, and that child's casket, Abina said, was laid on the table where the light came in the window. In the tradition of Abina's Celtic ancestors, unusual lights commonly foretold a death. Reverend Walter Gregor, a 19th century Scottish folklorist, wrote that such a light was known as a dead candle. In some cases, it was a pale blue light that moved about the house, or even along the road of a future funeral procession. If bright, greenish lights appeared in the room of a dying person, they were said to be spirits awaiting the departure of the soul. Catherine McClellan of Iris told folklore scholar John Shaw about a light that hung onto the shoulder of her father-in-law one night when he was traveling home to Luz. At the time, a child in the neighborhood was gravely ill and not expected to live, and he was building a coffin. And that's what it was. The light stayed on his shoulder until he got to this place where the child died.